2 years had passed since Jake Morrison arrived at Void Station Omega as a condemned prisoner from Earth. The facility that had once been known as the galaxy's darkest prison was now something entirely different. Rehabilitation centers across 12 star systems sent representatives to study the transformation. Military academies included Jake's cooperation methods in their leadership training. Even the Galactic Council was debating new laws based on what they had learned. The numbers told an incredible story. Recidivism rates among released prisoners had dropped to almost zero. Violence within the facility was down 90% from historical averages. Infrastructure maintenance costs had decreased dramatically because prisoners were fixing problems instead of creating them. Most remarkably, prisoner satisfaction surveys showed higher happiness levels than many free planets reported. But the real change was deeper than statistics could measure. Void Station Omega had become a community where beings from dozens of species worked together toward common goals. Former enemies shared knowledge and resources. Predators had learned to protect instead of hunt. Criminals had discovered that building was more satisfying than destroying. Jake stood in the observation deck that had once been used to watch gladiator fights and death matches. Now it overlooked workshops where Venatori warriors taught crystalline beings how to forge metal tools. Classrooms where hive queens lectured on advanced mathematics to audiences of fascinated pirates. Medical bays where former torturers had become skilled healers under the guidance of crystalline Vex masters. The transformation was not complete and probably never would be. Some prisoners still chose violence over cooperation. Some guards remained, suspicious of the changes. Some officials argued that rehabilitation was too expensive and dangerous to implement widely, but the foundation had been laid for something revolutionary. Deputy Warden Carter approached Jake with a data pad containing official documents. His young face was serious, but his eyes showed excitement. "The review board has reached their decision. About your sentence." Jake took the pad and read the formal language carefully. After 2 years, his case had been reviewed by a panel of judges from multiple species. They had examined his original conviction for defending human colonies against corporate raiders. They had studied his transformation of Void Station Omega and the rehabilitation of thousands of prisoners under his guidance. The verdict was unprecedented in galactic legal history. Jake's conviction was being overturned based on new evidence about the corporate raiders' illegal activities. But more importantly, the court recognized his work at the prison as community service that had benefited the entire galaxy. He was being offered immediate release and full pardoning of all charges. Jake set down the datapad and looked out at the community he had helped build. "What happens to all of this if I leave?" Carter smiled. "That is the best part. The prisoners have submitted a formal petition signed by over 2,000 beings from 47 different species. They want you to stay, not as a prisoner, but as a permanent rehabilitation consultant. Admiral Gorvac has approved the position." The petition was unlike anything in galactic history. Criminals who had spent lifetimes hating authority were asking for Jake to remain in an official position. They wanted to continue learning about human cooperation methods and Earth's approaches to problem solving. They wanted to help other prisons implement similar programs. Jake read through the petition, signatures with growing amazement. Vexashawn had signed it with a note saying that Jake had taught him the difference between taking what he wanted and earning what he deserved. Sisika, the Venatori leader, had written that Jake showed her true strength came from protecting others. Kethmore, the crystalline Vex, had included a mathematical proof that cooperation was more efficient than competition. Even more surprising were the signatures from the guards and administration. Warden Zektar had endorsed the petition with a formal recommendation. Security Chief Cragg had written that Jake's methods had made his job safer and more satisfying. Captain Nix had submitted a detailed analysis proving that rehabilitation was more cost-effective than punishment-based corrections. The Admiral wants to expand the program to 3 other facilities, Carter continued. You would be responsible for training new rehabilitation consultants and developing standardized procedures. Basically, you would be revolutionizing how the galaxy thinks about criminal justice. Jake thought about Earth and the home he had not seen in 2 years. He thought about the forests and oceans and the life he had planned before the trial changed everything. Then he looked at the community around him and saw beings who had chosen to be better than their worst moments. He saw hope where there had been despair and cooperation where there had been only conflict. I need to talk with some people before I decide, he said finally. That evening, Jake called a meeting in the main assembly area. Representatives from every species and sector gathered to hear what he had to say. The room was crowded with beings who had once been enemies but were now friends and colleagues. The air hummed with dozens of different languages as groups discussed what they had heard about the petition. Jake stood before the assembled crowd and felt the weight of their attention. 2 years ago, I came here as a prisoner. I was angry and hopeless and convinced that my life was over. You could have killed me or broken me or driven me insane like so many others who arrived here. Instead, you taught me something amazing. He paused and looked around the room at faces that had become familiar and dear to him. You taught me that no one is beyond redemption if they choose to change. You showed me that enemies can become friends through understanding and cooperation. You proved that even the darkest places can become sources of light if people work together. The room was completely silent as Jake continued. Now I have a choice to make. I can leave this place and return to my old life, or I can stay and help build something that has never existed before. A system where justice means helping people become better instead of just punishing them for being bad. Sisica the Venatori stood up first. Her scarred green scales caught the light as she spoke in her hissing voice. You saved us from ourselves, human. You showed us that we could be warriors who protected instead of destroyed. Stay and teach others what you have taught us. Kethmore, the crystalline Vex, added his chiming voice to the discussion. Logic supports your remaining here. The probability of successful rehabilitation increases dramatically when proper guidance is available. You are that guidance for our community. Even Vexishon, the former pirate lord, spoke up. His cybernetic implants glowed as he addressed the crowd. This human took criminals and made us into something better. He took a prison and made it into a school. The galaxy needs more schools and fewer prisons. One by one, representatives from every group voiced their support. The Mathani wanted Jake to stay so they could learn more about human engineering principles. The Void Wraiths had found purpose in maintaining systems that helped others rather than hiding in shadows. The Hive Queens had discovered that their strategic minds could solve problems instead of planning conquests. Jake felt tears on his face as he listened to beings who had once been considered irredeemable criminals talk about hope and growth and the chance to help others. I will stay, he said simply, but only if we can expand this program to help even more people. We have proven that change is possible. Now we need to prove it can happen anywhere. The crowd erupted in celebration sounds from dozens of species. Venatori hissed with joy while crystalline beings chimed like music boxes. Mathani hummed harmonies while void wraiths swirled in complex patterns. Even the usually serious Hive Queen representatives clicked their mandibles in approval. Admiral Gorvac made the announcement official the next day. Jake Morrison would become the galaxy's first rehabilitation director with authority to implement his methods at facilities across multiple star systems. The position came with a staff of former prisoners who would serve as cultural liaisons and cooperation specialists. Captain Nix was promoted to admiral and given oversight of the new rehabilitation program. Her logical mind and attention to detail made her perfect for developing standardized procedures that could work across different species and prison types. She had learned that efficiency and compassion were not mutually exclusive. Warden Zektar became the head of a new training academy, where prison guards learned human cooperation techniques alongside traditional security methods. The old warrior found joy in teaching others that true strength came from building up rather than tearing down. Security Chief Cragg established the first interspecies conflict resolution program where former criminals taught current guards how to prevent violence through understanding rather than force. His stress levels had never been lower, and his job satisfaction had never been higher. The changes spread beyond Void Station Omega faster than anyone expected. Other prisons began implementing similar programs with remarkable results. Crime rates dropped on planets where rehabilitation replaced punishment. Recidivism fell to historic lows across the galaxy. Most importantly, beings who had been written off as lost causes found new purposes and meaning in their lives. The news traveled fast through the Galactic Prison Network. Void Station Omega had become something impossible, a maximum security facility where prisoners worked together instead of killing each other, where guards and inmates cooperated to solve problems, where the most dangerous criminals in space were learning to be better beings. Some officials saw this as proof that rehabilitation was possible. Others viewed it as a dangerous threat to established order. The debate reached the highest levels of government and military command. Admiral Gorvac found himself defending his decision to support Jake's reforms, while Captain Nix wrote detailed reports on everything she had observed. Then came the ultimate test. A transport ship arrived carrying the most notorious criminals in recent galactic history. Vexashon the Void Raider and his crew of 30 pirates had terrorized peaceful colonies for over 2 centuries. They killed for pleasure and stole for sport. Their capture had required 3 battle fleets and cost hundreds of lives. The pirates were scheduled for execution, but legal appeals had delayed the process. While lawyers argued about jurisdiction, the criminals would be housed at Void Station, Omega. Captain Nix saw this as the perfect opportunity to prove that Jake's methods only worked with desperate prisoners seeking redemption. "Place them in Sector 7 with the human," she ordered. "Let us see how his cooperation techniques work with beings who choose evil as a lifestyle." Jake watched the new arrivals through the security monitors. Vexashon was a massive creature with cybernetic implants covering half his body. His crew included assassins and torturers from a dozen species. These were not prisoners driven to crime by desperation or circumstance. They were predators who enjoyed causing pain and fear. The pirates took control of Sector 7 within hours. They drove out the Venatori through brutal violence and claimed the best living spaces for themselves. When food arrived, they took everything and left nothing for weaker prisoners. The carefully built cooperation between species began to crumble. Under their destructive influence, Jake could have fought them. The Venatori would have backed him and other species would have joined the battle. But violence would destroy everything they had built together. Instead, Jake chose a different approach. He studied the pirates like he had studied every other group in the prison. He learned their culture and codes and the things they valued most. Vexishon was not just a killer. He was an artist of destruction who took pride in impossible heists and daring raids. His crew followed him because he could break into any facility and steal anything from anyone. They were criminals, but they were also professionals who respected skill and planning above all else. Jake waited 3 days before making his move. He found Vexishon in the sector's command area, studying maps of the station. The pirate leader looked up with metal eyes that glowed red in the dim light. So the famous Deathworld human finally comes to surrender. Are you here to beg for mercy? I'm here to offer you something better than mercy, Jake replied calmly. I want to offer you the greatest challenge of your career. Vexishon laughed, with a sound like grinding metal. What could a caged prisoner possibly offer that would interest me? Jake smiled and activated a wall display showing the station's complete security layout. I want to offer you the chance to break into the most secure facility in the galaxy. Not to escape, but to prove it can be done. The pirate leader's glowing eyes focused on the display with sudden interest. Void Station Omega was legendary for its impenetrable defenses. Multiple shield layers protected it from external attack. Internal security included automated weapon systems and force fields that could contain any known species. No one had ever escaped from the facility. You want me to plan a breakout that we will never attempt, Vexishon said slowly. What is the point of such an exercise? The point is proving that even the galaxy's best security can be defeated by superior planning and teamwork. You would be working with the prison administration as consultants. Your job would be finding weaknesses and helping fix them. Jake had done something brilliant. He had taken the pirates' destructive skills and pointed them toward constructive goals. Instead of breaking things, they would be testing them. Instead of causing chaos, they would be preventing it. Most importantly, they would be using their expertise to help others instead of hurting them. Vexishon was intrigued despite himself. The challenge appealed to his professional pride. And what do we gain from this arrangement besides mental exercise? Recognition, Jake answered. Your analysis will be studied by security experts across 12 star systems. Your names will be known as the criminals who became the galaxy's greatest security consultants, fame without infamy. The negotiation took hours. Vexishon was suspicious, and his crew was openly hostile to the idea. They had spent centuries taking what they wanted through force. The concept of earning respect through cooperation was foreign to them. But Jake was patient and persistent. He showed them how other prison groups had found new purposes. The Venatori had become emergency response teams. The Crystalline Vex were medical researchers developing new healing techniques. The Mathani had designed more efficient life support systems. Even the Hive Queens were contributing strategic analysis to improve station operations. Every group here has found a way to use their skills for something greater than survival, Jake explained. You could be the greatest security consultants in galactic history. Or you could spend your remaining time as just another group of failed pirates waiting for execution. Deputy Warden Carter watched the negotiations through security cameras with growing amazement. He had seen Jake work with desperate prisoners and confused aliens, but these were hardened criminals who had chosen evil as a way of life. Yet somehow the human was finding common ground even with them. The breakthrough came when Jake offered to share something valuable. The Earth military had developed infiltration techniques that were unknown to galactic security forces. Humans had learned to break into facilities by understanding the psychology of the defenders rather than just the technology they used. "On my world, we have a saying," Jake told Vexishon. "The best way to understand a fortress is to think like the people who built it. You know how to attack systems from outside. We know how to understand them from inside. Together, we could develop security methods that no one could defeat." Vexishon's cybernetic implants hummed as he processed this information. His crew gathered, around him arguing in harsh whispers. Finally, the pirate leader made his decision. "We will try this consultation work for 1 month. If it proves worthless, we return to our own methods." What followed was the most intensive security analysis. In prison history, the pirates examined every system and procedure with the trained eyes of beings who had spent lifetimes breaking into protected facilities. They found weaknesses that the designers had never imagined, ventilation shafts that could be used as infiltration routes, power systems that could be overloaded to create distractions, communication networks that could be hacked with simple tools. But more importantly, they began to understand the value of working within the system instead of against it. When they identified a security flaw, they also proposed solutions. When they found a weakness, they suggested improvements. For the first time in their lives, they were building instead of destroying. Warden Zektar found himself spending hours with Vexishon discussing tactical principles and strategic thinking. The old warrior and the ancient pirate discovered they had more in common than either expected. Both had lived lives defined by conflict and violence. Both understood the art of war and the psychology of fear. But Jake had shown them that their skills could be used to protect instead of threaten. "Your human has done something remarkable," Vexishon told Zektar during one of their planning sessions. "He has turned predators into guardians without making us weak. We are still dangerous, but now our danger serves a purpose." Security Chief Cragg was amazed by the improvements the pirates suggested. His stress levels dropped to the lowest point. In his 15-year career as weapon systems were upgraded and patrol routes were optimized. For the first time, he felt like the prison was truly secure instead of just barely contained. Even Captain Nix began to see the value in Jake's approach. The logical part of her mind recognized that criminals who worked within the system were far less dangerous than those who opposed it. Rehabilitation was more efficient than constant surveillance and punishment. Cooperation required fewer resources than control through fear. The month trial period ended with remarkable results. Security. Efficiency had improved by 40%. Guard workloads had decreased significantly. Most importantly, the pirates had found a new sense of purpose that satisfied their need for challenge and recognition without requiring them to hurt innocent people. Admiral Gorvac returned to review the progress and found something unprecedented. The galaxy's most wanted criminals were working as security consultants for the facility that held them. Their expertise was being used to develop new protection protocols that would be implemented across the entire prison network. 6 months had passed since Jake arrived at Void Station Omega, and everything was about to change. The prison had never been so peaceful or so efficient. Prisoners who used to fight daily now worked together on projects. Species that had been enemies for centuries were sharing resources and knowledge. Even the guards were less stressed because their jobs had become easier. Then the solar storm hit. The alarm sirens woke everyone at once with their screaming metal voices. Red emergency. Lights flashed through every corridor, and automated voices announced the danger in dozens of languages. A massive solar flare had struck the station's outer shielding, and radiation was leaking into multiple sectors. Captain Nix stood in the command center watching damage reports flood her screens. Sectors 8, 11, and 14 were contaminated with deadly radiation levels. 300 prisoners were trapped inside those areas with no protection. The logical response was clear. Seal the contaminated sectors and let everyone inside die. It would prevent the radiation from spreading and save the rest of the station. Begin emergency containment protocol, she ordered. Seal all blast doors to the affected sectors. Reroute life support to clean areas only. Jake was in Sector 7 when the alarms started. He felt the station shake as blast doors slammed shut throughout the complex. Through the security monitors, he could see prisoners in the contaminated areas pounding on sealed doors and begging for help. Their skin was already starting to burn from radiation exposure. Jake ran to the command center, but guards blocked his path. Prisoners are not allowed in restricted areas, they told him. Return to your sector immediately. People are dying in there, Jake shouted over the alarm noise. We can save them if we act fast. The guards laughed. No one cares about, dead prisoners. Go back where you belong, but someone was listening. Lieutenant Alex Carter was a young human officer assigned to Void Station Omega 6 months ago. He had watched Jake's transformation of the prison with amazement and growing respect. When he heard Jake talking about rescue operations Carter made, a decision that would end his military career. Carter found Jake in the maintenance tunnels where Void Wraiths were gathering to help. The gas beings could move through radiation without being harmed, but they needed guidance and organization. Tell me what you need, Carter said quietly. Jake stared at the young officer in surprise. You could be court-martialed for helping prisoners? People are people, Carter replied. Human, alien, prisoner, guard. If we can save them, we should try. Jake's plan was simple but dangerous. The Void Wraiths would scout the contaminated sectors and identify safe pathways through the radiation. Crystalline Vex healers would treat radiation poisoning in the wounded. Venatori warriors would carry victims who were too weak to walk. Even the Hive Queens would help by calculating the safest evacuation routes through mathematical analysis. The first rescue team entered Sector 8 wearing improvised radiation suits made from maintenance gear. Jake led the way with 3 Venatori warriors and a cloud of Void Wraiths to guide them. The radiation detectors on their suits clicked like angry insects as they moved through the contaminated corridors. They found the first group of prisoners, huddled in a storage room. These were Fulani refugees who had been arrested for illegal immigration. Their fur was falling out in patches, and their eyes were burned from radiation exposure. Without treatment, they would die within hours. We are here to help, Jake told them in their native language. Follow us and stay close. The evacuation was like a dance with death. The Void Wraiths flowed ahead to mark safe paths, while the Venatori carried prisoners who could not walk. Jake coordinated everything through hand signals and short radio bursts. They moved quickly but carefully through areas where invisible radiation could kill in minutes. Back in the command center, Captain Nix watched the rescue operation on her security monitors. She was furious that her orders had been disobeyed, but also amazed at what she was seeing. Prisoners and guards were working together to save lives. Species that normally killed each other on sight were cooperating in perfect coordination. This is madness, she said to Warden Zektar. They will all die from radiation exposure. Then we will have even more casualties. Zektar watched Jake directing the rescue teams with military precision. The human moved through the chaos like a conductor, leading an orchestra. Every being in the operation knew their role and played it perfectly. Perhaps madness and wisdom looked the same from certain angles. The rescue teams worked for 6 hours straight. They pulled prisoners from collapsed areas and carried them through radiation zones that would have killed unprotected beings in minutes. The crystalline Vex healers worked constantly to treat radiation sickness, while methane gas experts filtered contaminated air. But the real breakthrough came when they reached Sector 11. This area had taken the worst damage, and the radiation levels were lethal. No rescue suits could protect against that much exposure. The prisoners trapped inside were already dying. Jake studied the sector layout and radiation readings. There was only one way to reach the survivors. Someone would have to go in without protection and work fast before the radiation killed them. It was a suicide mission. "I'll go," Carter said quietly. "I'm the lightest and fastest. I can get in and out before taking a lethal dose." Jake shook his head. "You have family waiting at home. I'm already serving a life sentence. This is my choice to make." Before either human could move, a massive figure stepped forward. It was Kethmore, the crystalline Vex leader. His diamond body was cracked from recent molting, but his light burned bright with determination. "Crystal beings absorb radiation differently than flesh creatures. I can go where you cannot." Jake watched in amazement as the crystal being walked into the contaminated sector. Kethmore's body glowed brighter as it absorbed the deadly radiation. He moved through the area like a living star and carried out 6 prisoners before his crystal form began to fracture from overload. The crystalline Vex healers worked desperately to repair their leader's damaged body. They poured their own energy into him and used rare minerals to rebuild his crystal matrix. It took hours, but they saved his life. When Kethmore opened his crystal eyes, he looked at Jake with something like friendship. "You showed me that strength means protecting others," he said in his chiming voice. "Today I learned what that truly means." The rescue operation saved 280 lives. Only 20 prisoners died from radiation exposure, and most of those had been wounded before the rescue teams arrived. It was the largest successful evacuation in prison history, and it had been organized by a convicted terrorist with help from his fellow inmates. Admiral Gorvac arrived 3 days later to investigate the incident. He was a practical hegemony officer who cared more about results than regulations. The numbers told an interesting story. Prisoner deaths were at historic lows. Infrastructure maintenance had improved dramatically. Guard stress levels had dropped significantly. Even escape attempts had stopped completely. "Explain to me how a maximum security prison has become safer and more efficient," he demanded during a meeting with the senior staff. Captain Nix struggled to find the right words. "The human prisoner has implemented unauthorized cooperation protocols. Inmates are working together instead of fighting. They are maintaining systems instead of sabotaging them. Some are even reporting security concerns they discover." Admiral Gorvac studied the reports with growing interest. "And what is the downside of these developments?" "It violates established prison management protocols," Nix replied. "Prisoners are not supposed to organize across species lines. It could lead to coordinated escape attempts or rebellion." The Admiral looked at Warden Zektar. "What is your assessment of the situation?" Zektar chose his words carefully. "In my experience, beings who have hope and purpose are less likely to cause trouble than those who have nothing to lose. This human has given the prisoners something more valuable than freedom. He has given them the chance to be better than they were." Admiral Gorvac made his decision quickly. The hegemony valued results above ideology, and the results at Void Station, Omega, were undeniable. The prison was working better than ever before. I want detailed reports on all these new procedures. If they can be replicated at other facilities, we could revolutionize the entire prison system. Lieutenant Carter was quietly promoted to deputy warden instead of being court-martialed. His willingness to risk his career to save lives had impressed the admiral. Captain Nix was assigned to study Jake's methods and write new training protocols based on human cooperation techniques. But the biggest change was in how the prisoners saw themselves. They were no longer just criminals waiting to die. They were members of a community working together to build something better. Species that had been enemies for millennia discovered they could be friends. Predators learned that protecting others was a higher form of strength than hunting them. Jake stood in the observation deck that had once been used to watch prisoners fight and die. Now it overlooked work areas where former enemies taught each other new skills. Venatori warriors were learning crystalline healing techniques. Methani engineers were studying void wraith maintenance methods. Even the hive queens were consulting on security improvements. 3 weeks had passed since Jake arrived at Void Station Omega, and he was still alive. This surprised everyone, including the guards who bet on how long new prisoners would last. Most died within days from violence or starvation or simple despair, but Jake was different. Instead of just trying to survive, he was learning. Every morning, Jake walked through the sectors and watched how the prison worked. He saw patterns that others missed. The crystalline Vex in Sector 12 never fought with anyone because their silicon bodies were too fragile. But they collected medical supplies and knew how to heal wounds better than any doctor. The problem was they were too proud to help other species, and other species were too afraid to ask. In the lower levels lived the Void Wraiths. These gas creatures had no solid form and could move through the station's air vents and maintenance shafts. Other prisoners thought they were spirits or ghosts, but Jake noticed they were actually fixing things. Broken air filters got replaced. Damaged power cables got repaired. The Wraiths were keeping the station running, but no one knew why. The most dangerous prisoners were kept in isolation cells far from the main sectors. These were the hive queens from the insect worlds. When they were captured, their colonies died, and it drove them insane. They scratched mathematical equations into their cell walls and spoke in number sequences that meant nothing to anyone. The guards treated them like wild animals. Jake realized that Void Station Omega was not just a prison. It was an ecosystem. Every species had a role to play and needs that had to be met. The system worked because each group found a way to survive, but it could work better if they cooperated instead of competing. The test came when sickness spread. Through Sector 15, the Methani prisoners were dying from a plague that attacked their lung systems. Their blue skin turned gray and they coughed up blood. Within days, 12 of them were dead and 30 more were getting worse. The guards said it was natural selection and refused to help. Jake went to Sector 12 to talk with the crystalline Vex. Their leader was called Kethmore, and his body looked like living diamond. He was beautiful and terrible at the same time. Light bounced off his crystal skin and made rainbow patterns on the walls. When he spoke, his voice sounded like wind chimes in a storm. "Why should we help the gas breathers?" Kethmore asked. "They are weak and we are strong. This is the law of the prison." Jake sat down on the floor to show he was not a threat. "Because you are going to molt soon. I can see the stress fractures in your crystal skin. When that happens, you will be helpless for 3 days. Who will protect you then?" Kethmore's light dimmed with surprise. Most species did not understand crystalline Vex biology. "You know of the molting time?" "I know many things. I also know the Methani control the food distribution system. If they all die, who will make sure you get the silicon supplements you need to grow new crystal skin? The Vex leader was quiet for a long time. His internal light pulsed as he thought about Jake's words. Finally, he spoke. "What do you want, human? Help me save the Methani, and I will make sure you are protected during your molting. The Venatori owe me a debt. They will guard your sector." 3 hours later, Jake led a team of crystalline Vex healers into Sector 15. They worked with careful precision to treat the sick Methani. The crystal beings could see inside living tissue and identify exactly what was wrong. They created medicines from minerals in the asteroid rock and taught the Methani how to prevent future outbreaks. News of the cooperation spread through the prison like wildfire. Species that had been enemies for generations watched in amazement as the healing took place. Some of the guards thought it was a trick or a plan for escape. But Jake had no interest in running away. He was building something better. Warden Captain Nix arrived to investigate the situation. She was a Zenthari with pale skin and silver eyes that missed nothing. Her species believed in logic and order above all else. Emotions were weaknesses, and cooperation was inefficient. She looked at the mixed group of prisoners working together and saw chaos. "This is against all prison protocols," she told Warden Zektar. "Prisoners are not supposed to organize across species lines. It threatens the control structure." Zektar watched the security monitors that showed the healing work in Sector 15. "The violence reports have dropped 30% in areas where the human operates. Prisoner deaths are down 60%. Infrastructure damage is at an all-time low. Perhaps chaos is more efficient than order." Captain Nix did not like this answer. She ordered increased surveillance on Jake and his growing network of allies. But the more she watched, the more confused she became. Jake was not building an army or planning an escape. He was solving problems that the prison administration had ignored for years. When the Methani recovered, they wanted to repay Jake's kindness. Their leader spoke to him in the common area where all sectors met. "You saved our people when no one else would help. What payment do you require?" "No payment needed," Jake said. "But I do have a request. The void wraiths in the lower levels are lonely. They miss their home world and have no one to talk with. Could you teach them some of your gas form communication methods?" The Methani were surprised by this strange request. No one cared about the void wraiths. They were seen as pests or cleaning tools. But Jake had saved Methani lives, so they agreed to help. What happened next amazed everyone. The void wraiths had been maintaining the station for years without any reward or recognition. They did it because they remembered their home world, where gas beings worked together to keep their cities functioning. When the Methani taught them new ways to communicate, the wraiths became more efficient and more willing to help. Air quality improved throughout the station. Power systems ran more smoothly. Even the food distribution got better because the wraiths could identify problems before they became serious. Captain Nix watched these improvements with growing unease. The human was changing fundamental systems that had worked for decades. Jake's next project was the most ambitious yet. He wanted to communicate with the hive queens in isolation. These insect females had been cut off from their colonies and their minds were breaking from the separation. Most people thought they were beyond help. But Jake remembered something from his military training about emergency communication methods. He spent days learning the mathematical patterns the queens scratched into their cell walls. Slowly he began to understand that they were not random marks. They were equations that described hive-mind connections. The queens were trying to rebuild their mental networks using pure mathematics. Jake started tapping number sequences on the walls outside their cells. Simple patterns at first, then more complex ones. The response was immediate. The tapping from inside the cells became organized and purposeful. The queens were talking back. Through mathematical communication, Jake learned that the queens still had brilliant strategic minds. They could solve complex logistics problems and predict system failures. They just needed a way to feel useful again. Jake arranged for maintenance problems to be presented to them as mathematical puzzles. The results were incredible. The queens solved engineering challenges that had stumped the station's technical staff for months. They designed more efficient prison layouts and identified security weaknesses that no one had noticed. In exchange, they got the mental stimulation they needed to stay sane. Security Chief Cragg was a battle-scarred Ursinian who had run prison security for 15 years. He was used to violence and corruption and desperate escape attempts. He was not used to prisoners making his job easier. When Jake's reforms reduced daily incident reports by half, Cragg did not know what to think. "I have never seen anything like this," he told Warden Zektar during their weekly meeting. "Prisoners are solving their own problems instead of creating new ones. They are maintaining equipment instead of breaking it. Some of them are even reporting security issues they discover." Zektar nodded slowly. The old warrior was beginning to understand that humans were more than just another violent species. They had something that other races lacked. They could look at broken systems and see how to fix them. They could find common ground between enemies and build cooperation from conflict. But change always brought resistance. Not everyone was happy with Jake's reforms. Some prisoners preferred the old ways where strength was the only law. Some guards worried that cooperation would lead to organized revolt. Captain Nix believed that any change to established systems was dangerous by definition. The test would come soon when new prisoners arrived. The next transport ship would bring the most dangerous criminals in the galaxy, pirates and murderers and war criminals who had never shown mercy to anyone. Jake's methods worked with desperate prisoners who wanted hope. But would they work with beings who chose evil as a way of life? The transport ship Crimson Tide moved through the dark space between stars like a metal coffin carrying the dead. Jake Morrison sat in the prisoner hold with heavy chains around his wrists and ankles. The metal was cold against his skin and made every movement hurt. Around him sat creatures from dozens of worlds, all heading to the same place. None of them spoke. Jake looked out the small window at the black void outside. Somewhere out there was Earth, his home world that the aliens called a Class 12 Deathworld. He thought about the green forests and blue oceans he would never see again. The trial had been quick, and the sentence was life without chance of release. The Galactic Court said he was a terrorist for defending human colonies against corporate raiders. Jake knew he was just a soldier who protected innocent people. The alien guards whispered when they thought he could not hear them. They spoke about Terra, and how anything that lived there had to be a monster. They said humans were violent killers who ate their own young and fought wars for fun. Jake almost laughed at their fear. If they only knew that most humans were farmers, and teachers and shopkeepers who just wanted to live in peace. The ship shook as it dropped out of hyperspace. Through the window, Jake saw their destination. Void Station Omega hung in space like a giant rock with metal growing out of it. The prison was built inside an asteroid the size of a small moon. No sun warmed this place, and no planets orbited nearby. It was the perfect spot for a prison because nothing lived here, and no one would come looking. A guard with blue skin and 4 arms unlocked Jake's chains from the floor, but left them on his body. The guard's name tag said Officer Clicks, and he smelled like burnt metal. Clicks pushed Jake toward the airlock where other prisoners waited in line. Most of them were twice Jake's size, with claws and fangs and armor plating for skin. They looked at the human with curiosity and hunger. The airlock opened, and cold air rushed in. Jake felt the artificial gravity of the station pull at his bones. The air tasted like recycled fear and old blood. A massive creature waited for them in the docking bay. It stood 8 feet tall, with an insect body covered in black armor. Its forearms ended in claws that could cut through steel and its compound. Eyes saw everything at once. This was Warden Zektar of the Thrakari species. Jake had read about them in military files. They were warriors who lived for battle and respected only strength. Zektar looked at each prisoner as they walked past him. When his eyes fell on Jake, the warden stopped moving. Zektar clicked his mandibles together, making a sound like breaking glass. He spoke in the common galactic language with a voice like grinding rocks. "So this is the human from Terra. You look small for a Deathworld killer." Jake met the warden's gaze without fear. "I am not a killer. I am a soldier." The other prisoners turned to stare. No one spoke to Warden Zektar like that. The insect warrior tilted his head and studied Jake like a puzzle he wanted to solve. "We shall see what you are human. This place has a way of showing the truth about everyone." The processing center was a long metal room with machines that scanned and cataloged each prisoner. Jake stood still while red lights examined his body and recorded his genetic information. A computer voice announced his details to the room. "Human male designation Jake Morrison. Origin world Terra, classified Deathworld level 12. Convicted of terrorism and murder. Sentence life imprisonment, no release date." The other prisoners moved away from Jake when they heard about Terra. Even the most dangerous criminals in the galaxy feared Deathworld species. They had heard stories about planets where the weather could kill you, and the animals hunted in packs, and the plants were poisonous to touch. They thought anyone who survived such a place had to be evil. Warden Zektar explained the rules as they walked deeper into the station. "There are no cells here. Prisoners live in sectors carved from the asteroid rock. Each sector belongs to whichever group is strong enough to hold it. Food drops happen once per day. Medical care is earned through strength. The weak die quickly." They passed through heavy doors marked with warning signs in dozens of languages. Jake saw prisoners watching from holes in the walls. Some had bright scales that caught the light. Others were covered in fur or had metal parts replacing body pieces. All of them looked hungry and dangerous. The corridor opened into a vast chamber carved from solid rock. This was Sector 7, and it belonged to the Venatori. Jake had heard about them in the war reports. They were reptile hunters from a world where everything was prey. 7 feet tall with teeth like knives and claws that never stopped growing. They moved like liquid death and killed for sport. 20. Venatori surrounded Jake as soon as the guards left. Their leader was a female with scars covering her green scales. She hissed when she spoke, and her forked tongue tasted the air. "Fresh meat from the death world. I am Sisika, and this sector serves me. You will give me your food rations and water allowance. You will clean our waste and tend our weapons. If you refuse, you will feed us instead." The other Venatori laughed and clicked, their claws together. They expected the human to beg or cry or try to run. Prisoners always broke when they first arrived. The smart ones submitted quickly and became slaves. The stupid ones fought and died in minutes. Jake looked around the circle of predators. He counted their positions and measured the distance to each one. His military training kicked in automatically. These were enemy combatants in a hostile environment. The rules of engagement were simple. Survive and protect others if possible. I will not be anyone's slave, Jake said quietly. Siska's eyes went wide with surprise. Then she threw back her head and laughed. The tiny human thinks he can fight Venatori warriors. This should be amusing. She signaled to 3 males who moved forward with claws extended. What happened next shocked everyone watching. The first Venatori lunged at Jake's throat, but the human was not there anymore. Jake moved like water flowing around rocks. He stepped aside and used the attacker's momentum to send him crashing into the wall. The second one tried to grab Jake from behind, but found himself thrown over the human's shoulder onto the ground. The third Venatori was smarter and tried to circle Jake slowly. But Jake had grown up on a world where everything wanted to kill him. He read the predator's body language like a book and knew exactly when the attack would come. When the Venatori pounced, Jake caught his wrist and twisted until bones cracked. The warrior dropped his claws and fell to his knees. The sector went completely silent. 3 Venatori warriors lay on the ground, groaning in pain, but none of them were dead. Jake had beaten them without killing them. This was impossible. Deathworld. Species were supposed to be mindless killers who destroyed everything they touched. Jake walked over to where a young Venatori sat in the corner. The juvenile was injured and had not eaten in days. Jake pulled out his water ration and offered it to the youngster. Drink this. You need it more than I do. Siska stared at the human in complete confusion. Predators understood strength and weakness. They knew how to kill and how to dominate, but this behavior made no sense. Jake had proven he could fight, but chose mercy instead. He had won, but gave away his prize. High above in the security center, Warden Zektar watched the scene on his monitors. In 30 years of running prisons, he had never seen anything like this. The human was changing the rules of the game before it even started. This was either very dangerous or very interesting, maybe both.